of course, talk about today the Russian Empire. I think it's the main thing we'll kind of talk about because that's I guess, the peak period of really the age of absolutism that's real well known and all that. So I'll talk about that. I'll kind of go into the history of Russia, which, does go back to medieval times. Like it kind of starts in the early to high Middle Ages. So I'll get into that. I'll talk about the Rurik dynasty, which was a early dynasty of Russia. But I'll get to the main dynasty we'll talk about today, of course, which is the Romanov dynasty, which I'll probably be talking about that a lot because when I get to the 19th century, I'll kind of talk about them more and all that. Of course, we do talk about the Russian Revolution, of course, later that totally changed Russia and all that as well. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and, like I said, talk about the background, of course, of Russia, Russian absolutism, and all that, which really starts with Ivan the Terrible. Ivan the Fourth, I think, is really considered the first absolute ruler you have. They have the so-called czars later that ruled over Russia, although the early rulers weren't czars. They weren't really called that. I think they were called princes or grand princes throughout Russia. But I'll kind of get into the background of Russia. Russia itself, like I said, started in the Middle Ages, like in the 9th and the 10th centuries CE. The early Russia, if you study about it, is often called the Kievan Rus, which was either a Russian state or a collection of states that were primarily in Western Russia and also the Ukraine as well. They were based around cities like Kiev, Novgorod, and Moscow. Those are like the early cities that were kind of important in Russia. And they do think that the early Russians, if you study about, the rise of Russia and all that, they were kind of influenced by the Vikings. When the Vikings came in, of course, to Russia, kind of show you kind of a map of like the Vikings exploring into Russia. But yeah, Russia was explored by the Vikings, I think, starting around the 9th and 10th centuries. They came out of Scandinavia, like probably from Sweden mostly. And they were called different names. Like I know the people in Russia, and I think in the people in the Byzantine Empire, like the Slavs and the Greeks, called them either the Rus, sometimes pronounced Rus also as well, or the other name they were called too was Varangian as well. Either one was used. And the term Rus or Rus supposedly derived from the fact that the Vikings would row their long ships, those ships that they used to get into Russia and explore it. And I suppose the word Russia means land of the Rus or land of the Rus, but I guess land of the rowers is the fact that the Vikings rowed their ships and all that. I think the word Rus means to row or something like that. They explored, you see, these are the main rivers they went down. They went down the Don River, the Dnieper, the Volga rivers, trying to reach like the Black Sea, Aral Seas. But also they were trying to link up with a lot of the trade with Asia, Oriental trade, like Silk Road coming east to west, which went, towards Constantinople, all that. So they began trying to trade with like the Byzantine Empire. They later were influenced a lot by the Byzantine Empire overall. You can see in that map, by the way, where it says Kievan Rus and all that. One of the, of course, main early, capitals of basically the early Russian state was Kiev, or Kyiv, as they call it also as well, which you can see is located now the capital of Ukraine today. And as you know, it's kind of a controversy, because of the war going on over there, that Russian-Ukrainian war that just broke out several months ago. And so, yeah, there's a lot of conflict about that. Some Russians think that should be part of Russia. And of course, some people think, no, it should be separate and all that. And so obviously the West is more supportive of obviously Ukraine and all that. But I want to get into like some of the early leaders that were, part of Russia, which a lot of the early leaders were, related to Vikings that they had. It's got a few right here, but you got Prince Rurik. You may have heard of him. He was believed to have been an early ruler of Russia that came in, they think, sometime in the 9th century. And he's the one that kind of led to eventually the people starting to settle there and create a state over time. And they went by titles. He's considered to be the one that really founds the whole Rurik dynasty, which the Rurik dynasty was one of the first Russian dynasties they have that goes up to like the around the late Middle Ages. And he was Grand Prince of Kiev, Grand Prince of Novgorod, which is up in the northwestern part of Russia. And so those are some of the early cities that were kind of considered important. Often called Rurik of Ladoga, I think also, but a lot of people call it Rurik or Prince Rurik, of course, for short. So I think Grand Prince was a title they used. Some people say also Grand Duke, like there's kind of a variation of it that they had. He had relatives later that were also rulers, like Oleg of Novgorod, I believe was like a brother or brother-in-law of his that was kind of famous as well. Askold and Dur, those are some later leaders that were famous. And then Olga of Kiev, they had some like early rulers that were even female as well. You see there overall. But over time, what happened was a lot of the Vikings came in and they merged with the Slavic culture and all that. And so became one people. Forget the percentage of Russian DNA that still has some Viking in it, but it's a certain small percentage. That's still, I want to say 10, 15% maybe or something like that. But some Russians are still related back to the Vikings and all that. Norwegian peoples, anyway. Or actually Scandinavians, with the proper term. Now, they had this particular leader who's pretty important of the early Rus that's well known, which is Vladimir the Great, or Saint Vladimir, or I think the Russians say Vladimir also as well. He was a very famous Russian ruler who lived between the 10th and the 11th century. I think they consider me the first major one of importance that heavily influenced, Russia and all that. And he was like a grandson of Olga of Kiev. And the thing that he's important with is that he's the one that converted the Russian people to Christianity. Because if you know about it, the Russians were heavily influenced by the Byzantine Empire, which had Orthodox Christianity. They did seek out other religions, believe it or not, like Catholic faith and others, but they decided to go with that particular faith, of course. And so that's the one that they adopted eventually. So he's important. I think he converted first, and then he began to convert everybody to, of course, also Orthodox, Christianity. And that's pretty much the main religion, of Russia today is the Orthodox faith, Orthodox Christianity. But yeah, the Byzantine Empire, which was located, south of where Russia is, based around the Black Sea, they were like a major influence, of course, on Russia overall. Not just religion, but architecture. A lot of their buildings were kind of influenced. Like you ever see St. Basil's Cathedral, of course, that's Red Square, Moscow. That was heavily influenced by Byzantine architecture. A lot of the culture, language, Cyrillic, which is the Russian language, was heavily influenced by Greek, from the Byzantine Empire. So that's another thing that they also were influenced also as well. Russia also later views like Moscow and later, I guess, the Russian Empire as being like the third Rome. You may have heard this about this before. That's a theological, political concept that a lot of the czars kind of bring about later, especially after I think Ivan III the Great comes in. So that's something you see that they kind of saw themselves as the successor to the Roman Empire, and so that's why later the rulers are called czars from the word Caesar that you have. Of course, what happened next, if you know about it, was Russia in the 13th century was invaded by the Mongol Empire, who developed in modern Mongolia today. Genghis Khan or Chinggis Khan, it's usually spelled either way. And so his empire within a few decades basically swallowed up parts of, Eurasia as it went pretty much east to west, took over all of China, of course, at one point, gobbled up parts of like pretty much Central Asia, reaching into like almost like parts of India, getting into the Middle East through Iran, Iraq, and then you can see it also pushed into parts of Europe through Russia, and then reaching all the way. They think the Mongols got to Poland at one point, believe it or not, Poland and maybe Hungary, etc. But you can see they got into like Russia and the Ukraine overall, and basically what ended up happening was the Russians. If you go to this map, which is they had this ruler I'll get to in a second, but eventually the Mongols broke up their empire into like several parts. The Great Khanate, I guess the Khanate of the Great Khan, which is to the east, that was mostly like China, Mongolia, Chagatai Khanate in the central part, Ilkhanate in Persia. But they had one you can see at the top. It was called the Khanate of the Golden Horde. That one was formed by this man named Batu Khan. Batu Khan was a grandson of Genghis Khan. I think I've got an image or a statue of him, which let me see where it is. So I believe here he is right here, Batu Khan right there. His forces pushed into like Russia basically at that point, and it became this Mongol vassal state, which you know about the Mongols, they kind of merged with the Turks. They also call it Russia, the Tatars, if you know about that. And so a lot of the Tatars were used as mercenaries, basically. And so basically the Golden Horde Khanate was a Mongol vassal state in parts of Russia, Ukraine. And for a long time, the Russians were under their thumb. You know, they had to pay tribute to them, money, or they would, burn down their cities and all that. And part of why they're called Golden Horde, by the way, was because I think there's two theories on that. One was the fact that the Tatars, the Mongols, would live in these golden colored tents. So they started calling them Golden Horde, because Horde was a nickname they called the Mongols, if you know about that. And also they had to pay up gold tribute, if you know about that as well. But apparently Kiev didn't want to pay for some reason. And so in 1240, if you know about this, Batu Khan laid siege to Kiev. The siege of Kiev, which 1240 is when it happened. They refused to pay him off. And so he burned their city down. And so that's part of why Moscow becomes important later, because Kiev, declined after that, wasn't as important. And so Moscow becomes really the capital later of Russia for a long time due to that issue. So that's basically, Genghis Khan and the Mongols. And the Mongols, they say, wiped out half of Russia at one point. Then you get into up to around the 15th century and all that. You start to see the rulers of Russia start to call themselves czars overall. One of the first, of course, to do that was Ivan III, who the Russians later call the Great. He's a very important figure, of course, in Russian history. And he was one of the first to really consolidate a lot of the Russian lands, which, believe it or not, by about the 16th, 17th century, Russia starts to be a huge empire. It starts merging out of, I think about the 17th century, they had several billion acres of land at one point overall. But he's kind of important. He consolidates all the Russian lands under one ruler. He even frees Moscow from Mongol rule. That's something that he and his grandson, Ivan IV, do. The Terrible, of course, will do. And so he's kind of important with that. The other things he did, too, that's famous. He's the one that moved to Moscow, and he began to renovate the Kremlin, which had been around before. I think it had been built before by previous rulers of the Rus, Kievan Rus. But so he starts to do that. They later adopt the double-headed eagle, which was something that came from the Byzantine Empire. A lot of states have had that in Europe, the double-headed eagle, Germany, Austria-Hungary, etc. And then also another thing he started doing, he started to call himself a czar, from the word Caesar, from Roman influences. which Tsar is spelled different ways, either CZAR. Some people spell TSAR also as well, but it's a very Russian variation of the word Caesar, is what the Byzantine Empire called their emperors a long time ago. It's partly because what happened was apparently he married this woman named Sophia Pelagina, and she was considered the niece of the last Byzantine emperor named Constantine the 11th, who, by the way, Byzantine Empire had collapsed in 1453 when the Ottoman Empire conquered it. And so from that idea, that's where Ivan gets this, I guess, political idea that Moscow is now the third Rome because Constantinople fell. And so he would marry this niece, of course, of his. And so that's basically, something that's kind of famous. Another thing about him, too, Ivan was also the second longest reigning ruler of Russia. 43 years or so was how long he reigned. He has a grandson later, we'll get to, who's more famous, Ivan IV, known as the Terrible, who reigned around 54 years. So I think those two are considered really the longest reigning, but Ivan III was never officially known as, like an official actual czar, because he wasn't crowned with the title. I think it's called Grand Prince of Moscow or something like that. There, of course, image of the Kremlin. You can see, of course, right there is the Grand Kremlin Palace in the background. That's where the president of Russia, it's like the White House for them, where Vladimir Putin lives, basically. That's the Kremlin with its red walls, of course, you see, which is like a fortification there, of course, really. There's another image, of course, of the Grand Kremlin Palace, of course. Right, I'm going to get in next. I want to, of course, talk about a little bit about Ivan the Terrible. That's, of course, the next thing. Did want to get into, like, in the 16th century. So you got Ivan the Fourth, who comes in, which was a grandson, like I told you, of Ivan the Great, Ivan the Third. That you have. Really, they consider him to be the first official czar of Russia. So he'll be crowned czar in 1547. He is the most absolute of the Russian monarchs that you have. You can see he reigned 1530 to 1584. So yeah, his reign was definitely the longest, close to around almost 54 years that he was in power. He was considered to be a tyrannical type ruler, known for even committing genocide against his own people. He does start something that is famous in Russian history. He starts what they call the Tsardom of Russia, which from 1547 to 1721, all the Russias are known as Tsar. That's the title they go by. And then Peter the Great, in 1721, founded the Russian Empire. 1721, 1917, that existed. So all the rulers are afterwards called Tsar and Emperor, like both of them, but usually Emperor of Russia is the common title, of course, that they use. His actual name is like kind of like a terms of endearment, sort of. Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Terrible, basically. Translates as different meanings, formidable, fearsome, or even awesome, I think is another translation that they call. So it's not terrible as in a terrible person, but it's this man that people were scared of, Ivan the Terrible. So his enemies feared him, even his own people feared him also as well. I think there was a tale about him that was told when he was born, that when he was a child, he had born with two teeth, one teeth to devour his enemies, like the Mongols, and the other tooth to devour his own people as well. I've got some images to show you also. Of course, one of his most famous things that he built, if you know about this, is St. Basil's Cathedral, which is in Red Square in Moscow. And it's, of course, a perfect example of Byzantine architecture with its onion-shaped domes that, heavily influenced, pretty much Russian architecture and all that. Probably one of the most famous buildings in Russia, that and, of course, the Kremlin. That's there now, and some of their palaces also, like in St. Petersburg. But how it was built or why it was built, really, Actually, it was built in the 1550s to commemorate Ivan the Terrible's military victories over what is Kazan. Kazan was this Mongol Tartar or Mongol Khanate state that was to the east, kind of like close to Siberia, and he conquered it. And of course, that later decided to build something to commemorate it. So he built this church, this cathedral, of course, in Moscow, named after Saint Basil or Basil, of course. So it has something he's very famous for. But like I said, it's well known for its onion-shaped domes you can see in its architecture. Of course, the other thing he's notorious for, Ivan the Fourth, is genocide. He had this secret police force he formed called the Oprichniki, that's well known. Sometimes called the Tsar's dogs. And he used them to hunt down enemies of the state, whether they were people like the boyars that were against him, that were like the Russian nobility, or even peasants that didn't like his regime. He basically used them as the secret police force. And it did kind of lead to a lot of political, instability under him, like repression, basically. And so there's a lot of people under him that were put to death or imprisoned because of the Oprichniki. And some he regretted later, I know, overall, but it actually peaked, I think, in the 1570s. I think he eventually broke it up, but they did have this thing called the Novgorod Massacre, where the Oprichniki was involved in massacring maybe up to like 30,000 people in northwestern Russia. He feels that they were against the regime. And I think it was because a lot of them were kind of pro-Poland or something like that, or pro-Polish Lithuania or something like that. They wanted to break away. And so he was notorious for that. So he was known for a lot of genocide under him overall. Of course, I'll get to it, but Ivan, his what ends up happening, of course, with his regime, if you know about it, the Rurik dynasty would decline in the late 16th century. A lot of it was caused by the fact that Ivan killed his main heir to the throne, which was Ivan Ivanovich, or Ivan Ivanovich, that's how they say it in Russian. And so it led to kind of this chaotic period where the Rurik dynasty didn't have any good heirs afterwards that followed. And you get this period called the Time of Troubles in Russia, which was a period of anarchy where there were like hardly any major czars that really ruled. I think the only one that was kind of important maybe was Boris Godunov, you may have heard of. But it was really a bad time in Russia. And so eventually they had to put in a new dynasty into power. And so that led to the so-called, if you study about the so-called Romanov dynasty would come to power in 1613. The Romanov dynasty, as you know, is really considered to be one of the most famous of course, Russian dynasties. It was around, in power in Russia over 300 years. And so what happened was in 1613, the boyars, which was the Russian nobility, elected Michael the First. He would end up being the first czar of Russia that would come in. You can see the double-headed eagle, of course, the main symbol of the Romanov dynasty, of course, in the Russian Empire. And there's an image of course, Alexis Romanov, but supposedly Michael Romanov, if you want to know his background, he was actually a grandnephew of Anastasia Romanova, who was actually the seventh wife of Ivan the Terrible. Ivan the Fourth had 7 wives at one point that he went through. And so he was raised through his wife, not really through Ivan the Terrible. And so I think he was plucked from pretty much nobody knew who he was. I want to say he was a monk in a monastery when they found him. And so he was brought in. And so Michael Romanov, of course, became the ruler of Michael the First. I'm not sure they call him Michael the First because it was never a Michael the Second, but that's usually what they called him. Also, you can see there, they had also Alexis Romanov, who also was known as also Alexis or Alexia the First. He would reign next, 1645 to 1676, the second czar of the Romanov dynasty. They really consider him to be the first absolute of the Romanov dynasty that really comes to power. It's really under him that he begins to kind of weaken the boyars. And they had this assembly of the nobility that they had. He actually got rid of it. And so from that, he didn't really have a check on his power afterwards. And so a lot of the czars after that become, pretty much absolutists in the country, even up to like the 19th, and I think even up to the time of even the Russian revolutions, the czars have a lot of power overall. Now, I'm going to get in next, of course, with the Romanov dynasty. We're going to talk about, of course, some of the famous, rulers that were big as part of, the Romanov dynasty and the Russian Empire. Of course, you've got Peter the Great, who's well known, of course, really considered to be one of the most famous czars of Russia overall. So I'll talk a lot about him and his empire. But before I get to that, I did want to mention about the fact that Russia itself, like the nobility, had all this power in Russia, but they only made up about 1 to 2% of the actual population. It kind of gives you an idea of the way Russia is. Russia is mostly peasant population. I think they have a middle class later, but it's very small population. And so most peasants in Russia are later serfs, if you know about that, bound to the land. Peter the Great, that was something he was kind of known for expanding serfdom, of course, in Russia. Peter the Great, by the way, reigned from, here's the years of his reign, 1682 to 1725. So he was in power a pretty long time. Although I'll get to it later, he did have to share power with his half-brother, which was Ivan V. But yeah, he was considered the greatest czar of Russia. He's the one that really makes Russia a modernized power. He tries to make Russia more like a European power, like a France, Prussia, Austria, or even like the British Empire. And early on when he came to power, like I said, he had to share power with his half-brother, Ivan. But Ivan was, I think, kind of an imbecile. And so they actually had this half-sister of theirs named Sophia Alexeyevna, and she was the one that had the real power. She was the regent behind the throne. And so for about 6-7 years, really, Peter didn't really have that much power. Like, they basically just sat on the throne, and Sophia just told him what to say, basically to the court. However, after Sophia, I think he was able to sack her and Ivan died. That's when Peter really started to try to change Russia after that. Peter does this thing you may have heard about called the Grand Embassy, which was a tour of Europe in 1697-98. And what happened was Peter decided to go visit the West, find out more about it, technology, their military. So he visited like Poland. He went to the Habsburg monarchy. He visits France, England, and also goes to even Holland as well. I think he was also interested in trying to build up a Russian Navy, which is something he's very well known for founding a Russian Navy. So, of course, he came back to Russia, 1698, and then after that, he begins making a lot of reforms to Russia. So I'll kind of talk about some examples of some of the reforms that he's kind of known for, of course, with Russia. Here's some, of course, that's well known. Of course, one thing he's known for, Western dress. That's something that he's famous for. The fact that he tried to get all the men and women to dress like most people in Western Europe overall. All the men, if you know about that, he made them shave their faces. Maybe have a mustache or something like that, like he has in the picture, but force them to basically shave their faces. If you wanted to keep your beard, you had to pay a beard tax, and you had to carry, I think, a token around that has like a beard on it, saying that you paid the beard tax, and they don't have guys come around and cut your beard off, which actually they did that, and had people go around and cut your beard off. But potatoes is something that he was known for. Supposedly, he's the one that helped introduce the potato to Russia. But he increased serfdom, if you know about that. He introduced the Julian calendar. So he got like the first leap calendar was also given to Russia as well, because most in Europe were either using the Julian calendar or the Gregorian calendar overall. Also introduced a lot of art and culture. So Peter was seen as this enlightened despot. Catherine the Great is an enlightened despot also as well. So he wants to try to westernize Russia to be like other European powers overall. He also did some things with the government. I do want to mention this, like he reformed the government. I guess one of the most famous things he did was he created this thing called the Collegium, where he created all these departments of ministry in the government to help run the empire better. So there was like a Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a Ministry of War, Ministry of Navy, Ministry of Commerce, Justice, etc. That dealt with trade and things like that. And so that's something he's kind of known for, of course, trying to reform Russia. Then, of course, the other thing he did too, which is well known, military stuff. He modernized the Russian army, with superior weaponry. He even brought in like military advisors. Like there's this one man I think he brought in from, I want to say he was from Scotland, named Peter Gordon, I believe his name was. And he was kind of instrumental in trying to, better their military, use military tactics that are more like European powers in the West. And of course, the most famous thing he did, he founded the Russian Navy in 1796. So he's the father of the Russian Navy. I don't know if you know that or not. Now, the only thing, of course, about Peter would get into a lot of wars, of course, during his reign. One of the things that he, of course, did during his reign was he famously would try to get Russia warm seaports, because Russia at the time was kind of this landlocked state, which it was. And so he tried to get basically warm seaports on the Black Sea and also on the Baltic Sea, which Black Sea, he was able to eventually get part of the northern Black Coast against the Turks. He was involved in the Great Turkish War, which was kind of happening at the same time, where he backed Poland and also the Habsburg monarchy. And I think he had a so-called Azov campaign you may have heard about, where he seized this fortress Azov, which is on the North Black Sea. And so that's one of their first indication where the Russians are trying to push into the Crimea, to try to take that over, which they will by the reign of Catherine the Great in of course, the 18th century, a little later. But yeah, his greatest conflict really was the Great Northern War, which took a really good bit of his reign, like around 20 years, 1700 to 1721. That war was really considered to be Peter the Great's and Russia's first real major European war that they really got involved in. It involved Sweden, which was really an empire at the time, and this king on the right you see, which was King Charles XII, who was really considered one of their great rulers at the time. And they were fighting for supremacy over the Baltic Sea, especially the eastern arm of it, right there. And kind of show you a map here, but yeah, their empire, the Swedish Empire, was pretty big. It included like parts of like Sweden, Finland, and then also parts of like where northern Poland, Lithuania is on the Baltic Sea. And I think that area where the Baltic states are, etc. Even the area where St. Petersburg is now was actually controlled by the Swedish Empire at the time. Sweden was a pretty major power, at least up to the 18th century, but I think in the 19th they start declining after that. But they are kind of a major power to reckon with, like in Northern Europe at the time. Of course, what happened later, if you know about it, Charles's forces, they were kind of beat because of the fact that the Russians had a huge army. Their army was like, I think, under Peter peaked at like 200,000 troops. But the Russians were known for using a lot of scorched earth policies. When like an enemy would invade, they would try to like burn their crops and prevent, the enemy from really living off the land and all this. And of course, Napoleon found this out later when he invaded, Russia in 1812, et cetera. In Nazi Germany, I think supposedly when they invaded Soviet Union later, I think Stalin kind of used some scorched earth policies as well. And eventually, the Swedish forces were badly beaten at a battle, which I think is considered the most important one in the whole Great Northern War, which was the Battle of Poltava, which happened on July 8th, 1709. And so, with that defeat, Charles the 12th eventually was forced to abandon his invasion of Russia, and they think that kind of starts to cause the decline of the Swedish Empire after that, because Russia then uses that to expand, into part of the Baltic Sea overall. Then, of course, what happens, Peter then starts to build where St. Petersburg is today. There, of course, the famous palace of his, the Peterhof, that you're looking at. He begins the construction of St. Petersburg. 1712, they think, is the year, I think, when it's founded. It took like around almost 10 years for it to be constructed. It was kind of built in a malaria swamp, believe it or not, on the Gulf of Finland, kind of the eastern arm of the Baltic Sea. It does become the Russian capital between 1712 to 1918, before the Bolsheviks, if you know about it, moved to Moscow during the Russian Revolution, etc. St. Petersburg, by the way, is the second largest city in Russia, behind Moscow. 5.4 million people live there, of course, today. It's, of course, had different names. I think during World War I, they called it Petrograd, you know about it. Then under the Soviet Union, they called it Leningrad. So it's had multiple names overall. But yeah, that's one thing you can see there. He would build, like, one thing about St. Petersburg later, it'll be like, considered to be really this westernized city that Peter wanted, like the West. And he called it later the so-called window on the West. That is the Peterhof Palace, which was this late Baroque style palace that he began constructing more toward the end of his reign. I think it was founded right before he died. And it means Peter's Court is what the name means. I think it opened, I want to say, in 1721. So I know they just celebrated the fact that the fountains there you're looking at were like around 300 years old last year. So some people call that palace complex the so-called Russian Versailles, which kind of emulates other palaces, like Versailles and Schönbrunn Palace and others that we've kind of shown, etc. Here's kind of a better look. And you can kind of see also St. Petersburg, of course, in the background also as well. He built other things too there. He did build also supposedly this other complex here, which I believe that's the so-called Peter and Paul Fortress, which he constructed there because he thought that the Swedes were going to come back and try to attack the city of St. Petersburg. And so it was a citadel he constructed. But what's interesting about it wasn't just used as a fortress. It was used as, I think, a church there was built there. And then it was also used as a political prison up to the 1920s. Like the Okhrana used it, which is the Tsar secret police. And I think the early secret police of the Bolsheviks also used it under the Soviet Union, etc. Now I'm going to move on. Of course, there's a statue of Peter the Great, which was later, by the way, put there, I guess, in St. Petersburg by Catherine the Great. So that's kind of that statue, that equestrian statue that you're looking at right there. But yeah, I'm going to kind of talk about some of the other rulers that they had, of course, with the Romanov dynasty. So you can go all the way back to Michael the First. There were 18, by the way, Romanov rulers at one point. I think there's one missing, so they don't have in the list, which is Ivan the Sixth, who reigned kind of between Anna and Elizabeth. But you can see of the different rulers that they had. They had about 14 that were emperors or empresses. So 10 emperors, 4 empresses, female rulers that ruled over Russia overall. So really, Peter the First, Peter the Great, he was the first one to declare himself, emperor of Russia. The other ones there too, by the way, Catherine the First. If you see the second row far left, she was actually the wife of Peter the Great. She reigned briefly after Peter the Great died. And then Peter the Second reigned too, who was a grandson of Peter the Great. I think Peter killed one of his own sons, believe it or not. Yeah, so his son, none of his sons ever got the reign. Then you've got some female rulers that reigned too. Anna, Empress Anna, reigned for about 10 years. There was Emperor Ivan VI, who reigned as well, but he was overthrown by Empress Elizabeth in the middle there, who was one of the last daughters of Peter the Great. That's who I wanted to talk a little bit about. On the left, you see there, she basically reigned from 1741 to 1762, actually a little over 20 years, so really beyond, Catherine the Great. Really, Empress Elizabeth is considered the second greatest female ruler under that period in Russian history. Youngest daughter of Peter the Great. She didn't have any heirs to the throne, no children, and so she was forced to give eventually the throne to a nephew who was Peter the Third. I'll get to him later. It's mostly German origins. He was kind of unpopular. We'll kind of talk about how Catherine eventually gets into power, who's basically Peter the Third's wife. But briefly about Elizabeth, she was known for continuing the reforms. So, she was an enlightened despot also as well. She's the one that founded the University of Moscow. I don't know if you know that or not. She's one that began it in Russia, founded this actual school. And then she also is one that began a lot of the construction of the Winter Palace, which the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, one of the main palaces, of the Romanov dynasty, is built by successive rulers under the Romanov dynasty. I think she sent explorers, if you know about that, like we've talked about before. I think exploring like Siberia and Alaska and all that. That all happens kind of under her reign. Now we're going to get to, of course, the most important ruler today. I'll kind of, talk about, which is, Catherine the Great. Catherine the Great really is considered to be the greatest female ruler in Russian history. Probably considered to be the only great ruler that has that nickname, the Great. That's actually called that. I don't know if there's any other rulers that were called that pretty much. Well, we do know about her. She was considered an enlightened despot. She was this type of ruler that was like Peter the Great and Empress Elizabeth, wanting to modernize the Russian state, kind of continue the same trend that Peter the Great was trying to do in Russia. However, it didn't start out that way. Like you saw in a little short video, she was really this insignificant princess that was actually from Germany. Her real name was Sophia Augusta. She was from this small states in Germany called Anhalt-Zerbst, which is, I think, in the northern part of Germany. And she was a second cousin to this Charles Peter Ulrich, who was also mostly German, who was from Holstein in northern Germany. And the two married each other. So they were both, I think both of them were related back to the Romanov dynasty, like distant cousins, I guess, of Peter the Great and all that. And so she came to Russia, and she later changed her name to Katharina, or we say Catherine in the West also as well. And so, yeah, she came in. However, what happened was her husband, who took over as the Tsar in 1762, was unpopular. He was actually pro-Prussian. In fact, Peter III, I think, idolized Frederick the Great, thought he was a great ruler, didn't really like Russia, which is kind of a bad thing to do. If you're pretty much the ruler of Russia, don't like your own state. And I think they think he was crazy or unstable. I think there was even accusations that he may have been gay or something like that. Because I don't think there's even a deal where Catherine and him actually consummated the marriage. I think they never had sex or anything like that, some people claim, because they think Catherine had other lovers. Later had a son named Paul the First, who would be czar. Some people think it was fathered by somebody else and not him overall. So she would overthrow him in a coup in 1762, and they think she had him murdered, like had him killed. And so she was able to consolidate her power, of course, after that. So yeah, there she is right there. I'll kind of expand that picture there, show her. But yeah, her reign is considered a golden age of Russia. Like they often call it the Katerina era in Russian history. And so she would, continue a lot of the westernized reforms in the Russian state. I'll kind of talk about some things that she was known for her reforms, but she actually, tried to become Russian. She converted to Orthodox Christianity. I believe she was Protestant originally, and she converted to the Orthodox faith and all of that. And then, of course, basically learned the Russian language. She, of course, like I said, took up a Russian name or a pro-Russian name, basically, and all of that. I'll talk about some of the reforms that she's kind of known for, but you may have heard of the State Hermitage Museum. That's considered really one of the most famous things that she's known for establishing, which you know about the State Hermitage Museum, which is in part of the wing of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. It's considered to be one of the largest museums in the world, with over 3 million works of art that are actually in it. And the it has all kinds of paintings and other kinds of art that's there. I think a study about that museum, it goes back to, I think, even prehistoric, art and things like that. But now it's got a lot of Greek classical type art and artifacts that are famous. A lot of your great artists from the Renaissance are there. Renoir, Monet, Van Gogh, Picasso, Gauguin, Rembrandt, things like those are kind of artists that they have. Pizarro, I think, is another artist they've got. So it's got a lot of different works of art that it's kind of famous for, of course, today. She did other things too, like she founded you may have heard of the Smolny Institute. It's this educational school that he created for like women in Russia, mostly noble women overall, which was founded in the 1760s. That's the actual building that's still there today. That's in St. Petersburg. She also had an orphanage. I think they were talking about that in that little short biographical video on Catherine the Great. Yeah, she did have this orphanage that she founded also as well to try to, those that were orphans throughout Russia to, get them raised to become, I guess, good adults in Russia. So it's something that they're kind of known for. And I think it becomes more famous in the 1800s as an orphanage. But I guess it was kind of somewhat semi-successful, but it was later closed by the Bolsheviks later when they took power. Now, they do have this thing that broke out early in her reign that's kind of well known, which is the Pugachev Rebellion, 1773 to 1775. It was a popular revolt, which mostly happened like in Western Russia, part of the Ukraine, like around the Volga River basin. And this man named Emelian Pugachev, he was this Cossack soldier that started a rebellion, and he was hoping to basically abolish serfdom in the country, which is something that Catherine the Great had been thinking about doing. I think that was one thing she favored, was abolishing serfdom in the country, which was widespread up to the 1800s. However, a lot of the nobility didn't want to do that, to get rid of it. And so it's something she never really did that was I guess, considered a failure in her reign. And so, like, peasants joined up with him. They also had these so-called old believers you may have heard of in Russia that joined them, which were these Orthodox Christians that were opposed to a lot of so-called reforms of the Orthodox Church, which I think are called the Niconian reforms you may have heard of. So they joined it as well. And what's funny is this guy, Pugachev, claimed to be Peter III. He was actually dead. So he set up his own government as a separate government from Catherine's government. And so Catherine actually had to bring in the Russian army and crush it. And so by 1774, most of it was crushed by the Russian military. They captured Pugachev and brought him back in arms back to, I guess, St. Petersburg, where he was eventually executed in 1775 for the actual rebellion. Of course, some people call it a revolt also as well, kind of a debate about that, about what they called it. But they think the actual rebellion may have killed as many as 10,000 Russians, in this whole rebellion thing. But actually, if you study about serfdom will not be abolished until the 1860s. So it's almost like, not quite 100 years, but almost a century later before it actually gets abolished. Of course, the other thing she's known for, Catherine the Great, I guess the most famous thing was her expansion of Russia. She does expand it, westward, southward, and eastward. Like westward, she took over a good chunk of Poland. If you know about Poland, Lithuania, it was partitioned in the late 18th century after it became collapsed as a state. And so about 60% or more of it was actually taken over by the Russians, which is most of the eastern half of it, basically, which Russia for a long time claimed Poland as part of their empire, if you know it, for years. And under her reign, she also began to colonize parts of the Ukraine and also the Crimea. They started doing around the 1780s. So if you think about cities like Odessa, which is on the northern Black Sea, that was a city originally founded by the Russians. And then Siberia, Alaska, those areas in the east were also colonized a lot as well. You can see here's the partition of Poland. But yeah, at one point, Russia, Prussia, Austria, they actually gobbled up that whole area there, took it over. Catherine was, I think, the only one that actually was involved in 3 partitions of Poland, and she took over almost 2/3 of it from them. As you can see in this map here, that the Russian Empire, it's expanding, pretty much west to east toward the Pacific Ocean. So you can see pretty much by her reign, they're already getting into pretty much the Pacific area. They're also, starting to colonize Alaska around that 18th century at that time. Of course, the other thing they talk about Catherine the Great, you've probably heard this before about Catherine being this woman that had a lot of lovers, like maybe over 20 at one point. I think 22 might be the possible amount that she had. And so, yeah, there's legends that she was a nymphomaniac. She liked sex a lot. There was a deal where I think there's a story where she may have had this special cabinet made that had sex toys in it or something like that. And then there's also the urban legend about how she died. There's a story that she died making love to a horse, like a stallion, and it crushed her, basically. That's the joke about the horse on the on the bottom right. If you see that, there's another urban legend how she died too, that she died on a toilet. Yeah, but they think that's not true. I think she may have collapsed in her bathroom and died later, but they don't think that was what happened. But yeah, the stories about her liking sex a lot might be true about that. Her most famous lover, they think, was Grigory Potemkin. You may have heard of him. He's a very famous Russian general and statesman. In fact, he was the one that helped really Catherine conquer the Crimea and all that. And so that's one thing that she's kind of well known for, of course. All those lovers. Here, of course, are the later monarchs that come later. After her death, really the 2 most famous ones you got that come are Emperor Paul I, who reigned for about 5 years. That's her main son. That would be the ruler. It's kind of a debate about whether he was really related to Peter the Third or not. I don't know. That's still been speculated about that. Her grandson, Emperor Alexander I, was also very famous too. He was one that conquered, or actually defeated Napoleon, really. He was trying to conquer Russia, 1812. So he's also very famous as well. Then you can see they got also four other rulers that come later to the right-hand side there. You've got Nicholas the First, 1825 to 55. He was a brother of Alexander the First, who would reign later. He's the ruler when the Crimean War breaks out in the 19th century in Russia. Alexander II was a son of Nicholas the First. He's another ruler. He's famous for abolishing serfdom in Russia, well known. Alexander III was a son of Alexander II. He was another ruler. And then also the last Tsar of Russia, you probably heard of him, which is Nicholas II. He reigns 1894 to 1917. Of course, we'll talk about him later, Nicholas II. He'll get later overthrown because of the Russian Revolution and all that. So sorry about starting late today and all that. I was having technical issues today, so hopefully that won't happen again. But I did want to talk about a few things before I go today. I was kind of talking about how today I'll be posting, of course, the first exam. That's going to, of course, be posted to, I don't think it's published right now, but I'll put it up today. And I'll also put out an announcement, of course, about that assignment, which that'll be due for a while. It probably will be due, I want to say, into week 4 and 5, probably. We'll be open for a while. But yeah, you can see right now the assignments y'all need to do right now: exploration quiz, conquistadors quiz. Those are the two main things y'all need to work on, of course, the most. First, vocab, don't forget, that's due, I believe, Friday. So that needs to be turned in. Then you can go ahead and start turning early if you want. But that's something y'all need, of course, to work on. But I'll send out further emails later in the week to talk about kind of what's going on with the class. But that's it for today. I don't think there's any historical questions I got right now. I probably won't have time to do all that stuff today like I usually do. But I'll see y'all later. I'll probably have a recorded lecture later in the week, which is going to be probably for bonus points coming up, because I will have like a final exam bonus, a first exam bonus quiz I'll have, I think, post tomorrow. But I'll send emails about that, about what that's going to be and all that. So sorry about all the technical issues, of course, today that I have. But y'all have a great rest of the week and all that. And y'all, of course, take care. So see y'all later.